Hi there, my name is Neil Blevins, and this tutorial is called Clumping and Grouping. So this tutorial is going to discuss a number of things you should consider when clumping details together, which is also known as grouping details together. So clumping can take an otherwise boring image and make it more dynamic. And clumping happens a lot in nature, especially with plants, rocks, and mountain ranges and that sort of stuff. So here are two photographs of grass. And the question I have is, does the grass look more visually interesting all uniform like this? Or does the grass look more interesting all clumped together like this? Hopefully you'll agree with me that the second image looks far more dynamic. And clumping can also be used for mechanical things, like details on a robot surface, or even the placement of spaceships in a space scene. Like you have all these ships over here and they're sort of clumped together in these groups, and if these were all uniform in the sky, it wouldn't look nearly as interesting. So let's take a moment to really define what clumping is. So when the eye sees objects that are related to each other, like the objects are near each other, or they're all a similar size or a similar color, the eye tends to lump all those objects into a single shape or group or clump. So clumping or grouping helps organize an image for the viewer and tends to be more aesthetically pleasing. Like this example here, this image has all the objects almost the same distance from each other, whereas this image here has the objects clumped together. And when the eye sees this image, it tends to create single objects of the clumps, grouping multiple objects into a single, larger object. Like a great example is this image here. So if you ask somebody what this is, they'll probably say it's a square made up of little lines. They won't just say it's a bunch of lines. And that's because their vision system groups together the lines into one object and then compares that object with known objects in its brain to give the answer. So our visual system enjoys grouping objects together into larger, more manageable objects. And so clumping can make an image more brain-friendly. So it makes it more aesthetically pleasing because the things that are more brain-friendly are more aesthetically pleasing. And this is due to the fight-or-flight portion of our brain development. So our visual system has become good at taking various visual clues and grouping them together so our brain can more easily recognize what the object is. A very long time ago, this helped us evade predators. Like, for example, if there was a tiger hiding in the grass ready to eat us, our visual system will take the little portions of the tiger it can see, group them together, compare them with stuff in our brain, and figure out that, hey, that's a tiger, and I need to get the heck out of here. So our visual system needed to become more good at grouping things in order to keep us alive. And now we can use those same tricks to help us make more enjoyable artwork instead of just saving our lives. So the rest of this tutorial is going to be clumping tips and tricks. And I have 10 of them for you. And remember that there are always times when these rules should be broken. But following some of these rules will tend to lead to better compositions. And plus, it's better that you know the rules so that when you break them, you're breaking them for a reason instead of just breaking them because you didn't know about them. So the first one is to avoid repetition in reference to number of elements. So if you have a clump of two objects, there shouldn't be another clump of two objects nearby. So right here, if we have two objects that are clumped together, we don't want another two objects nearby that are clumped together in a similar way. Instead, if you have these two objects that are clumped together, the one beside it should maybe have three. Next is to avoid repetition of size. So don't have two objects in a clump that are the same size. Like here you can see these two are exactly the same size in this clump. Instead, make sure that every object in a clump has different sizes. And in a similar fashion, make sure that two clumps are not the same size, or else they'll compete for each other. So this clump, even if it had different things in it than this clump, they're both about the same size as a clump. And so instead, it's much better to have a bigger clump and then a smaller clump nearby. Next is another avoid repetition, but this one is about spacing. So there should be an irregular distribution of details. So make sure that you have uneven spaces between objects in your clump and between the clumps themselves. So here you can see that each one of these objects in the clump have sort of the same space between them. And this one is far more interesting because you have bigger spaces and smaller spaces between the clumps. And then similarly, if you have three clumps here, and each of them has exactly the same space between them, this is more boring than if you make sure that you have bigger and larger spaces between the clumps themselves. Tip number 4 is an odd number of elements. So frequently, clumps look better when they contain an odd number of individual elements, like 3, 5, or 7. And clumps with an even number of elements, like 2, 4, or 6, tends to not quite feel as balanced. And this principle is even found in bonsai plant grouping. This is a little quote from the Bonsai Empire website. Although bonsai are often planted solitary, trees in nature are more commonly found in groups. Creating a bonsai forest or group planting requires an odd number of trees. Tip number 5, overlapping objects. So having your objects overlap provides visual interest by creating depth. So in this case, since all of these are not overlapping each other, they all look like they might kind of be on the same plane. Whereas this one, because they overlap each other, it looks like there are trees in front of trees in front of trees, which creates depth in the image. Tip number 6, small, medium, and large. And this is one of the most important tips I've found. And that is, if you're going to have clumps of things, instead of having all the objects be about the same size, make sure you have one large one, one medium one, and one small one. Or, with those odd number of objects as mentioned in the previous tip, make sure that you have one large one, a couple medium, and then a couple of small. Tip number 7 is small outside, big inside. So smaller details should generally be on the edge of the clump, and larger details should be more in the middle of the clump. So while this looks okay here, the outside ones are larger, and this one here, the larger ones are in the middle, and the smaller ones are on the outside, creating kind of this pyramid effect. Tip number 8 is clumping using color or value. So as well as just being near to each other, 2 or more objects can form a clump if they have the same color or the same brightness. And that allows you to use, for example, lighting in order to make clumps of separate objects. Tip number 9 is that the whole is important. So the viewer should not be looking at a single item that makes up the clump. They should be seeing the whole made up of all the items. So if you have a situation where when you look at a clump, like these are clumped together because they're near each other and far away from other stuff. But if you look at the clump and you tend to find that your eye is staring at individual members of the clump, then you probably haven't quite succeeded yet. And you can use one of the other tips earlier to make sure that it feels like one single cohesive object. And then finally, standout items. So even though the whole is important, don't forget to add a standout item or two inside of your clump to keep things varied. Now you don't want to make something that's so overpowering that it destroys the grouping that we've worked so hard on in all the other steps, but just something a little bit different so that you avoid stuff looking too monotonous. So here's a quick example of some of these principles used in my image from 2007, Planetary Defense. So the principles I used were, first of all, none of the cannons are exactly the same size, and that's tip number 2. The spacing between each cannon is slightly different, which is tip number 3. Well, there are technically 4 objects in this clump of cannons. The 4th one is almost completely obscured by the dust. So really you have 3 standout elements in the clump, which follows tip number 4. Then there's small, medium, and large cannons, which is tip number 6. The largest cannon is on the inside, and the smaller ones are on the outside, which is tip number 7. The background cannons are clumped together because they have generally the same value because of all the dust back here, which is tip number 8. And then to avoid the monotony of 4 identical cannons, I rotated each slightly, and I also added the people nearest the close one, just to give something a little different, which is tip number 10. So again, these tips are not hard and fast rules. There are plenty of spectacular images out there that violate many of these rules. But by using a few of them in your composition, it can help make it stronger. So next time you're doing a composition, try grouping and try following some of these tips and see if it improves your images. So thank you very much. I hope you found this interesting. If you would like to read more tutorials like this, please go to neilblevins.com and go to the Art Lessons section. And if you want to be notified the next time I post a new video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.